welcome back to this second panel of this workshop. Also, thanks a lot for inviting me. It was a pleasure to see all of you and actually to follow a debate. I haven't followed that much because I've been working in this field for a long time in the past, and then slightly turned to other certainly related issues in the past years. But it's good to continue the discussion on citizenship and naturalization indices. And so we start the second panel on the lessons we learned over the last years and also the next steps we should take in this field, with three presentations by three researchers that have already made, I think, important contributions to this field from various perspectives and are still making important contributions with the work on which they work, as we will see in the presentations. And three scholars that not only work on different continents, but also investigate or study different world regions with a very international profile. Luisi, who has been in Germany for a long time and worked at the German Institute for International and Area Studies, and who is now back in Mexico. Samuel from Switzerland, who is about to finish his PhD at the UI in Florence and is currently working at the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen. And last but not least, Giacomo Solano, who is his PhD in Amsterdam and Milan and is now working for the migration policy group in Brussels. And I suggest that we start right away with the first presentation by Luisi. You each have like 13 to 15 minutes, and so we'll do the three presentations. After this, I will give some general comments, and then we can open the discussion.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning. You can hear me well, right?
Right.
Okay, excellent. So greetings from Mexico City. It's nice to see you. I'm only a bit sad that I couldn't join you for the sessions earlier, but it was definitely way too early for me. In my presentation today, I will try to give you some very simple and general messages about the road that we still have to go, and the lacunae that we still have to fill up, and the blind spots that we have to take care of. And much of what I'm going to say is based on a research note that my colleague Pau Palop Garcia and I wrote for the APSA newsletter on migration and citizenship in 2019, and also on a paper that we wrote together in 2017 that is entitled "The Gray Areas Between Nationality and Citizenship." That one was published in Citizenship Studies. But starting with the APSA piece, in that piece we want to offer some proposals on how to increase the geographic and temporal coverage of indices in the field of migration and citizenship, and how we can hope to also become a bit more detailed and sophisticated regarding the details of measuring stuff that we have found to be relevant in different regions. Importantly, we also address the scope, so the whole spectrum of migration policies and not merely immigration policies and policies that are relevant to immigrants. I'm sorry. And some of you who have been familiar with my work and Pau's work in the recent years will know that we have contributed slightly more modest effort than the indices usually spoken about in this kind of fora, that is called the EMICS, and it deals with immigrant policies or diaspora engagement policies. So for us, it's always very important to remind our audiences that there are migration policies for immigrants and for diasporas as well. And I will give you some examples of why taking that into account is also extremely important when we try to improve better and perfection our indices on naturalization policies, how that comes back to the naturalization of immigrants. But let's get started. I didn't prepare a PowerPoint presentation because my talk is going to be very simple. I will be speaking about 4 challenges or 4 blind spots And then I will give you some concrete examples of how our work on immigrant policies and citizenship policies in Latin America and the Caribbean took us to 5 new different questions that, for example, could be added to an index like the global SID for the world, if it goes really global. Okay, so let's get started with the lacunae or the challenges that we found to exist in our review of, I think it was 17 or 18 different indices in that research piece. We didn't try to be exhaustive. These are not all the indices that are out there, but I think we managed to give an ample enough review of the most important efforts. And we focused on emphasizing aspects like the coverage in time, whether these are longitudinal efforts, the coverage in space, also the geographic scope of these indices, and finally a point that we made in the piece very, very important and that I won't emphasize as much here in the presentation, which was about transparency standards and trying to agree on some common standards of publication of our data, of our code books, of our source books, and so on. So getting started with the challenges, let me tell you that none of them is really easy to tackle. And the first of them, and the most obvious one, is the geographic lacuna or the geographic challenge. The practical circumstances that sometimes push us to focus on the OECD world or European Union countries and their neighborhood are quite obvious. The data is, there is a multiplicity of data sources for these countries, which allows us to cross-validate with other readily available data sets. The information is public and reliable. These are the regions in which we ourselves tend to work and to be financed. Also, the rules for data publication tend to be public and very clear. Moreover, there is like a harmonized framework that allows for greater comparability of our research to a larger N if we want to conduct some causal analysis later on. So I won't delve further into these reasons, which are, as I said, rather obvious. And there's no easy fix for this kind of geographic lacuna, but I think they can be fixed with the proper planning and proper investments. Some of these blind spots keep reproducing themselves because we still do not invest in producing better data, and that's why towards the end of my participation today, I will make a recommendation to the effect of creating a greater community of experts all over the world. But there's also a set of factors that feed into this geographic lacuna that make it bigger. And these factors are less obvious than the ones I mentioned before. And they're related to not only to resources, but also to some implicit bias. And this is really a proper blind spot that we need to solve. And in order to solve it, I think we have to be a bit more self-critical about how we divide the world into, how we create our universe of cases, how we divide our world into relevant and irrelevant cases, how we frame our research puzzles, and what kind of questions, what kind of research questions we ask. This all has to do with our intrinsic interest in the world and how much we can expand questions that were, let's say, created first for a small scope of countries in Europe to the rest of the world. I'm happy to say that there are some improvements here, and I'm very, very glad to see the global SID going global lately, and more reports coming from Asia and from Africa in the late months. But some of the blind spots, I would like to just say very briefly here, are rather subtle. And this is also something that Pau and I have noted in some papers. And one of them is the very popular differentiation between countries of immigration and countries of emigration. as if this was something very obvious. Researchers simply go for the net migration rate and lose really a lot of the migration dynamics in just following these net migration rates that you know, it's perhaps helpful to do some justification for research design purposes, but it's also artificial and in our opinion can be misleading in many ways. So that was the geographic challenge. Let's move on to the level of analysis. This is quite relevant for implementation of naturalization rules, I'm afraid. So I think it would be time that we start to tackle also and move beyond the policies on paper. I think it's a spot where we have found ourselves between many indices, and it's a sweet spot, but maybe it's time to start tackling the challenge of how to measure how these things are implemented. I recently learned that MIPEX is developing some piloting efforts to also tackle the implementation of immigrant policies, and also tackling another level challenge, which is the subnational level. So I will let Giacomo tell us about these sort of experiments. And I'm happy to report that I hear all the time lately about doctoral and postdoctoral research projects that are tackling also the different levels of analysis and looking at how naturalization regulations are implemented in practice in lower levels. And of course, I see Mark in the corner, and I remember his dissertation. So this is not new, but it has taken a while for us to jump from the Swiss case to other more complex cases. A third challenge is to take cognizance of gender differentiations. I think this is a tough one, but one that very often comes to the fore in naturalization rules that treat differently spouses, depending on whether it's a man or a woman. That this is an obvious one that we have found to be very relevant for some Asian cases. A fourth challenge is trickier, and that is to try not to portray policies that as general when in reality they are not. Sometimes we work with categories that are perfectly plausible as theoretical constructs, but have no correlate in reality. And an example of that we have tackled recently is the category of high-skilled and low-skilled, which really doesn't exist as such in the regulations of some countries. But for naturalization, which is the issue that we're discussing today, I can imagine that a challenge is to be aware of differentiations which might not be obvious, departing from frameworks that have been developed in the OECD world and Europe, but which are very relevant in other regions. And one example of that takes me to the closing part of my presentation, where I mean to tell you something about how citizenship and nationality differentiate through some very crass gradations of the citizen rights that naturalized citizens have, in contrast to citizens by birth, and also that dual nationals have in contrast to mononationals. So this paints a less rosy picture, for example, with regard to the growing acceptance of dual nationality all over the world. I see Martin is sitting there, and he's one person that has been aware of this very asymmetric possibility of having dual nationality that is very different for immigrants and for emigrants. But here we're speaking about also how the distinction between being born in the country or being naturalized also overlaps with dual nationality and multiple nationality. I won't give you too many examples of this because I think you can read them better in the paper. They are characterized in detail in that paper in citizenship studies. But I will tell you that the differences can be striking between how countries regulate the rights in terms of the portability of those rights, the exclusivity of those rights, and the range of proper citizenship rights. And by this I mean the right to be elected, the right to vote also, but to assume a range of public administration positions, the rights are really striking. One of the most well-known cases is the case of Mexico, which has been worked at in detail by my colleague Enio Hoyo as well. But there are several cases in Latin America, I can tell you that, and that's there's an important variation, a range of variation between cases from Belize, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, El Salvador, Paraguay, and the cases around the Rio de la Plata, Uruguay, and Argentina. So to summarize this, the importance of this kind of distinction between the naturalized, the dual nationals, the naturalized who are dual nationals, we have come up with at least 5 more items that we would add to frameworks such as the global seat when it comes to naturalization. The one is the distinction between citizenship and nationality. This is a very basic one. That is to find out whether countries make that distinction explicitly in law and what are the consequences, which really goes beyond just determining that people become citizens when turning 18. On a second place, I would say whether there are different rules for immigrants who are dual nationals, if they have naturalized. So this sort of twists your mind, but these are people who first naturalized and then emigrate, and how are they treated differently or not? The third would be restrictions on citizenship for naturalized immigrants. So if their citizenship rights are less than citizens by birth. Also the loss or suspension of citizenship after residence abroad for immigrants who naturalize, that is, if they can lose their citizenship or their nationality if they emigrate. Finally, restrictions on the citizenship package, the package of rights for naturalized immigrants who are dual nationals. So it's a little of mind-boggling and mind-twisting, but these are 5, let's say, clear categories that we found to exist. I would like to conclude my participation by making a very general recommendation on how to continue tackling these global expansions of indices and data sets, beyond issues of measurement, refinement of measurement across countries and regions. And as I advanced before, I think this is a costly solution. This is not an easy fix, but I think it's going to be worthwhile. And it really boils down to training people from and in these regions, or the global south, if you will. So sometimes we have become very, very, very comfortable with the strategy of finding experts, but we know very well that sometimes we cannot find one expert who will be able to answer the questions, and I think that we need sometimes to train people who come from law, from political science, from history in these regions. And there is an element of socialization of knowledge in my proposal, but also of internationalization of science. These are big words that you can see in the scientific strategies of the EU and so on. But I think there's really much to be gained if we put some deeds to those words, to those big words. In a post-pandemic world, there's time, we can start planning now. In a post-pandemic world, these trainings and workshops could take place sometimes in Florence, in Europe, sometimes in other parts of the world. And in the end, I think this is not only some altruistic sort of endeavor or idealistic sort of endeavor, but it can only be for the best for ourselves as a community, because it will lead us to an enlarged circle of readers and interlocutors, to people with whom we can co-author papers, which know the languages, know the legal realities and historical realities in much more depth than ourselves. And of course, it will increase the potential impact of the data sets and indices that we create. So yeah, that and one thing that I see Paul there, and I want to say it also for the sake of our common endeavors, is something that I say in some round tables where some of us have sat together in the past. It's very important that model indices like the global seed, like IMPIC, like MyPEX come together and also support smaller efforts that are starting to fill the lacuna, are starting to fill the gaps, and that we hopefully try to rally around some big donors and get the funding to make some of these efforts longitudinal, because some of the smaller research projects simply don't have the funds to do that kind of longitudinal data collection. So that's it.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks. I think that was a nice summary of some of the research gaps, research challenges we face, and some next steps we should take. And I think we're all looking forward to maybe get invited to Mexico in the future. And yeah, Sam is next.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. Share the screen. Oh, you already see my conclusion. Okay. Okay, hello again to everyone. Thanks for organizing the workshop and thanks for inviting me. I'm very excited to do a presentation and to join you today. In my talk, I will review 3 existing approaches to measuring citizenship policies and to constructing indices in a very specific sense. Based on this review, I will introduce a new hybrid approach, and the main purpose of this hybrid approach is to achieve both context sensitivity and cross-national and cross-temporal comparability when constructing a global policy index. I will attempt to show that this is something that may be difficult to achieve with existing approaches. To go global, I think we need to go back to the basics. The seminal piece by Adcock and Collier is useful here. It can be seen as even more fundamental than the classic on-index building by Munk and Verkuylen. They also argue, like Munk and Verkuylen, that we need both concept validity or proper concept specification and measurement validity or proper operationalization. But they emphasize that we should move from concepts to measures and data and back in an iterative way in order to construct valid indices or measurement constructs. This is especially true for global indices, as new cases might create the need to adjust concepts and operationalizations. We must be aware that the notion of validity is bound to specific cases and contexts, and that global approach needs to be sensitive to context. We should be on the lookout. Is there something? Oh. Now this is a bit embarrassing. Let me share the proper screen with you. You see what I'm reading? Okay, this is better, right? Okay, good. So we must be aware that the notion of validity is bound to specific cases and contexts, and that a global approach needs to be sensitive to context. We should be on the lookout, especially for functional equivalence, as we search for varying instances of concepts across space and time. I think this is already well done in the global SIT approach that Martin has introduced in the morning. It is a scope condition approach that differentiates across broad systemic contexts. But we might need to adjust our instruments further as we expand even more across space and across time. And we might want to even cross systemic boundaries. As you see here, I do not address issues of aggregation, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. The classical approach to citizenship policy measurement is not context sensitive. Here you see an example using the classical approach. This is the concept tree of the Citizenship Regime Inclusiveness Index, or CITRIX, as we have already seen in the morning. It captures the inclusiveness of the access to citizenship for ordinary immigrants and their children. Note that this is a 3-level concept, an approach that is not always used in all classical approaches, as often the 2nd level is dropped. On the basic level, so on the 1st level here, on the top, there is an overarching concept or policy idea. Here, the aim is to have a systematic idea of what it is we are measuring. On the second level, as we have seen, there are the constitutive components or dimensions of the concept. And here, to repeat, the aim is to cover all relevant aspects and to find a balance between minimalism and maximalism. Based on the literature and other indices, Citrix does so by covering conditions regarding birthright in terms of jus soli, residence, renunciation, and integration. It therefore focuses on the ordinary naturalization of ordinary immigrants and jus soli for their children. Only on the third level, there are indicators that operationalize these components. This classical approach heavily depends upon theory that we can disagree on. For instance, one could say that we should distinguish economic and criminal record requirements from civic integration conditions in the form of language and citizenship tests. And one could, for example, say that we should then have a new policy component on the second level that captures further requirements in addition to civic integration conditions. One could also argue that years of residence is too reductionist. As we have seen before, we could, for example, also include permanent residence requirements, or we could also consider shorter residence requirements for spouses or refugees. Another issue is the measurement level. For the residence condition, for example, we can record the exact number of years. We then have to determine the minima and maxima and normalize the measure. Here in Citrix, I define 0 years as the theoretical maximum, and in my sample, 15 years is the empirical minimum, and I use a linear rescaling method to normalize the index so that it ranges from 0, the empirical minimum, to 100, the theoretical maximum. Another approach here to the left is to collapse the measure into an ordinal construct, as is done by MyPEX. This means that we lose information, but this has the advantage that we can better calibrate the measure and determine to what we regard as relevant variation. Typically, we also use equally spaced intervals so that the measure feels like a numeric variable. Here, MyPEX uses the generic 0, 50, 100, which translates the ordinal nature of the indicator into a somewhat numeric idea, which is then used to aggregate. The new global SID data that Martin presented in the morning has nominal, ordinal, and numeric options for this specific indicator. And I think this is very promising, offering a toolbox for different constructs for potentially different purposes. This classical approach has the advantage that separate indicators and the index can be directly compared across space and time. There is direct information about both relative and absolute levels of inclusiveness, and there is indirect information about policy changes and their magnitude. But of course, we encounter the usual challenges of index building, concept specification, measurement, aggregation, and also validation. The disadvantage of this classical approach is that we superimpose a concept across potentially diverse contexts. This is why internal validity in terms of dimensionality is so important. Conceptual dimensions must be shown to exist also empirically in statistical terms, so that the theoretical superimposition is valid. We should use validated indices, but we should also not let statistics drive theoretical decisions. Another disadvantage of the classical approach is that by defining fixed indicators and content, it assumes homogeneity or equivalence across space and time. And this may be the main problem that this approach faces for going global. The second existing approach focuses on policy changes only. This has been done, for instance, by the DAMIC database. Here you can consider any change, you can assess the direction of change, and you can, in terms of restrictiveness, and you can code the magnitude of change. This allows for a high applicability across space and time. But for this, we of course still need a concept that tells us when we see what we are looking for. And another challenge is how to define and code the magnitude of changes, which poses potential issues for validity and reliability. Again, DAMIC shows a potential way how to solve these challenges. Aggregation can also be done here, but it has a different meaning. It refers to composite changes and magnitude of changes in odd levels. And the disadvantage is that we have no information about relative or absolute levels of restrictiveness. Also, if we do not further code the content, for instance, if a change is about residence or integration conditions, we cannot compare more specific changes across space and time. And DAMIC is more general, so it only has this category for access to citizenship, although there's also the target group that they code, which is one potential further information we can consider. Now, the third approach is what I call the flexible single indicator approach, which is less well known. This has been applied by Margaret Peters to construct an immigration policy index. Here you see the single composite scale for citizenship policy. Lower values stand for more difficult naturalization processes, and the maximum value stands for an easy process. Now, this all seems a bit much, you see it here, but the point is that we mix various aspects, for instance, language testing, residence, and also incorporate jus sanguinis or jus soli, which may be valid or not. We can discuss this, but the aim is here to translate policy configurations directly into a composite ordinal score. Here is how this applies to the example of the UK. The starting point with jus soli and residence leading to subjecthood is coded as 4.5. This is from 1792, which is why we speak of subjecthood and not citizenship in this case. This could be regarded as cross-temporal equivalence, but it also highlights the challenge of achieving comparability across contexts, and in this case, across centuries. In 2005, we have a score of 3.25, which is a small deduction, you see here, compared to 2002, because of slightly tightened language and citizenship testing. You can see that we need very good reasons for how much we deduct here, and these are given in the appendix by the book of Peters, in the book of Peters. But you also see that this is very flexible and that we can also consider equivalence and fine-grained changes that are difficult to define in a homogeneous way ex ante. So overall, with the flexible single indicator approach, you can consider any change, you can assess direction and magnitude of change, and you can apply it to various contexts, and you have information also about levels. But of course, also here we need a clear concept and a clear operationalization. In addition, we need even clearer definitions of minima and maxima, and we need sufficient guidance for the many gray areas and levels in between. We also have to determine a starting point in each country and assign an initial composite score. And we need to grapple explicitly with what we consider as equivalent across space and time. If we meet this challenge successfully, which is hard, the only disadvantage is that we do not have separate indicators to compare separate aspects of citizenship policies. And this is where my proposed hybrid approach comes in. When going global, first of all, we should reconsider the basic level concept. Inclusiveness can be seen as a normative notion based on liberal democratic theory. This concept does not necessarily suggest that more inclusion is more democratic, and the latter concept would be even more normative. Perhaps we could speak of the more neutral notion of restrictiveness instead, as has been done by the immigration policies in comparison or IMPIC project. One other possible solution is the new differentiated or scope condition global sit approach that Martin presented in the morning already. According to that approach, we can apply certain concepts such as inclusiveness only to certain contexts, or at least we could do so. Martin hasn't done that exactly, but that would be one way to implement this further. On the second level of the concept, as you see here, we should again clearly identify the relevant constitutive policy components. This level therefore follows the classical approach to identify in advance our potential suspects. It is therefore less open-ended than the single flexible indicator for all dimensions. Instead, each of these components can then be used as a flexible single indicator to be operationalized further on the third level. On this third level, we can define categories that are more generic and flexible than in the classical approach, following instead the approach by Peters. This may allow us to identify potential functional equivalents, such as informal rules, implementation, or other context-dependent or more contingent differences, but only as they apply to predefined policy components. We should also think about what we do with cases that have no relevant provisions. For instance, such cases could be assigned the minimum or the maximum, as is done in the global sit approach, as well as IMPIC. With the generic coding scheme for each policy component, we can consider any relevant change, we can assess direction and magnitude of changes, and we have information about levels. Here, DEMIC, a database that records changes also in access to citizenship, as I have said, could be used as a starting point. Of course, this hybrid approach cannot do away with the fundamental challenges of index building that we talked about so much already. Also, the hybrid approach I outlined serves the purpose of comparing policy components and index values in terms of ordinal or quasi-numeric levels across space and time. If the goal is to provide a global toolbox, then this hybrid approach is already one step further than the groundwork of identifying relevant policy components, nominal variation, and policy changes in the first place. MIPEX and the new global SIT approach have laid some groundwork for this already. As the global version of Citrix based on global SIT data shows, as Martin has shown, the classical approach has the potential to reach wide. However, a hybrid approach may still be needed to accommodate more cases, especially as we go longitudinal. Now, this slide on validation and aggregation is just for those that want to look up this input in the recording. These ideas are to be published in a paper in the coming weeks, and we can also talk about that and the importance of three-level concepts in the Q&A. For now, I'll leave you with the idea of the hybrid index approach, which may be useful or not at all. I'm curious what you think about it, and I thank you for your attention and engagement.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Sam. A lot of food of thought for a lot of methodological issues that are actually quite important to think about. And yeah, let's continue with the third presentation by Giacomo Solano.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to share the screen. So if you see my presentation, so first of all, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I would like to add so many stuff like following the presentation before me. Maybe we can discuss about these very interesting issues in the Q&A session. In my presentation, I'm going mainly to present a review of migration policy indices that we have done last year. And also I will introduce the 2020 edition of the Migrant Integration Policy Index of MIPEX, with a focus, of course, on naturalization policies. But since both the analysis of the review and also the MIPEX are not only on naturalization policy, I'm going to try to go also beyond that. So the first part of this presentation, as I said, concerned this review of migration policy indices. So we conducted a mapping and a review and analysis of existing indexes. It's updated to 2020, and it has been done in the framework of the Horizon 2020 cross migration. The objective was to build on previous analysis and comparative analysis of existing indices, and to understand the trends and the gaps in the field. As a methodology, we conduct a literature review and a Google Scholar search by, for example, using as keyword policy index or indices and others. We decided to go for Google Scholar because some of the literature and some of the indexes have been also created by non-academic scholars or researchers. So Google Scholar fitted our purpose at the best. By this methodology, we found 67 indices or set of indicators at the national level. There are other 10 to 15 set of indexes that does not belong to the national level. So we just focus on the national level. The main results are going to be published soon in Global Policies as part of this special section that I edited with Mark Elbing, with Mark. And they're in April, it should be out, the issue. So I'm just confirming what Lucy has just said on the geographical part. But first, I want to start with the review, with the overview of the topics covered by the existing indexes. So most of the indexes, we found that most of the indexes focus on immigration policies, while only a minority also included or exclusively included immigration diaspora policies, like the case of EMIX or IMISEM from Lucy and Paul show. The most let's say, analyzed dimension or macro area of policy is the one related to the stay of the migrants in the country, so related to permanent residence and citizenship. And within this category, the most analyzed topic is citizenship. So we can see, or citizenship policies. So we can see that there are many indexes, 39 out of 67 indexes that have addressed this topic. So we can say, a kind of redundancy also of the information on this topic. But moving to the geographical scope of the analysis of these 39 indexes, we can clearly see that the majority of, let's say, most of these indexes are focused on one area exclusively, and this is the EU15 area. So if you can see on the left the rank of the most addressed or analyzed country, you can see that in the first 10 position, you have exclusively EU15 countries, including the UK. And other traditional countries of destination like Canada, US, and Australia have been analyzed to a lesser extent. You can see also from the table in the middle that Europe is really at the center of this analysis in general, both in terms of times in which at least one country has been covered, but also if you compare the number of times that a country of countries from Europe have been included out of the maximum amount of times that these countries can be included potentially. So you see that there is a geographical scope, and this confirms exactly what Lucy was saying as well. So now I'm moving to the second part of the presentation, and I'm going to briefly illustrate the findings of the new edition of the MIPEX, which has just been concluded and published in 2020, but at the end of 2020. Well, you all know MIPEX, so I'm not going really in detail on that. What I want to say is that this edition wanted really to go global, or to have kind of a first step towards going global. So currently we are covering all the continents except from Africa, but actually we are trying to fill this gap, and we are currently doing an analysis of South Africa, plus also the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But let's say the 2020 edition focused on 52 countries, including some Latin American countries like Mexico, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. We also expanded to additional Asian countries like India and China. Although they have a smaller share of migrants, they are, let's say, raising global actor, a very relevant global actor. So we decided to include them as well. These 52 countries related to these 50, or regarding these 250 countries, we have a longitudinal data set which cover from 2014 to 2019, while for other countries, like the European countries, the data set is longer, and we cover from 2007 to 2019. I'm not going into the indicators because Emilian this morning showed which are the indicators of MIPEX related to access to nationality. So I'm moving to the next slide, which address the results of MIPEX. First of all, I want to show the relation between the score of each country on naturalization policies, so the access to nationality strand of MIPEX, and the average of the combined other strand other policy areas. And you can see, and this also builds on an article that has been published by Martin and Thomas, by Vink and Thomas Adelston. And here, once again, and there was only on EU countries, but here, once again, it's confirmed that access to right or to integration policies in their broader meaning is related also to the level of naturalization policies in one country. Also, putting a little bit into perspective, let's say, the score and the level of policies on access to nationality. Here, this table compare this policy area with the other policy areas included in MIPEX. And you can see that access to nationality is one of the weakest areas, although it has halfway favorable policies, is one of the weakest area together with education and political participation across MIPEX 52 countries. Comparing the same, having a kind of longitudinal glance, comparing 2014 scores with 2019 score on average, so in comparing the average of MIPEX 52 countries, you can see that there was a slight improvement in the policy. So policies became slightly less restrictive. Well, the improvement was just by 1 point, but actually it's statistically significant. So I compared the score for the 52 countries, and the t-test showed that actually this difference is statistically significant, but still the improvement is very small. But I will skip this slide because I don't think I have enough time to go into details, and also Martin has really analyzed very well the state of policies. I want just to show that out of, let's say, of the 7 indicators that are included in MIPEX, the weakest points are related to the need or the request of a clean criminal record. And normally, or most of the time, this thing of being clean is related also to minor offenses or pending criminal procedure. And also another weakness is related to citizenship for immigrant children, where a naturalization procedure is required very often. So here I'm going to show the differences across countries, with the aim of understanding whether there are, let's say, differences between traditional, let's call it like that, MIPEX countries. So basically the EU countries and the traditional immigration countries like Canada and US or Australia and New Zealand, and the new countries in MIPEX, so the Asian countries and the Latin American countries. And also one of the statements that sometimes is behind or against the fact of going global is that our standards, or the standards that have been created or thought for EU countries, are not then applicable to non-European countries, and therefore the score of these non-European countries is always very low, let's say, and there is not much variation within them. Although this analysis of our MIPEX results show that this is not the case. Indeed, for example, among the top 5 countries in terms of score in the citizenship policies area, we can find Brazil and Argentina, for example, 2 Latin American countries. And at the bottom, we have some European countries, as for example, Martin was saying, Austria has a particularly restrictive approach toward the citizenship policies. You can see really that, for example, that Europe is, that our policies are quite restrictive in Eastern European countries, in the Baltics, and also in part of, or in most of, South Europe. As for example, in Italy, in Spain, and in Greece as well. To confirm, let's say, this analysis, this impression from the score, I also ran a regression analysis. The dependent variable is the MIPEX naturalization policy score. And I put some interesting variables as possible, let's say, drivers of the policy level. One of them was the GDP, and then another important part was done by migration-related variables. And the third layers was linked to the continent of the country. So you can see that although there is, let's say, there is much variation among non-European or non-Western countries, the GDP, so the level of development, let's say, of a country still matters. So more developed countries have less restrictive policies. But you can also see, looking at the results for the continent, that traditional non-European immigration countries have less restrictive policies. This works for the Western non-traditional countries like US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also for Latin American countries like South Africa and Brazil. So also thinking about Emilian presentation this morning, I think that this must be or should be related or linked to the fact that these are also former colonies. Then I want to conclude with showing something that goes beyond a little bit MIPEX. But as part of this edition, we also conducted a desk research of academic papers linking MIPEX to what we call integration outcomes. So MIPEX or integration output to integration outcome. Here there is one of the several examples linking MIPEX citizenship strand to citizenship acquisition, and we can see that the level of policies here has a positive impact on the acquisition of citizenship for both, in this case, male and female. So we can, and this is in part related to the implementation part that we were talking about before. As we know, MIPEX does not include implementation indicators, but as a way of showing that actually the level of policies on paper, let's say, influence really the state of integration of migrants, we conduct this meta-analysis. And this is also related to my conclusion. So we, as Martin was saying, there is a discrepancy between policies on paper and in practice. And this is even more true, let's say, when it comes to non-Western countries. We assume that, let's say. So one of the idea, now that we have some data that goes beyond European countries, would be really to understand the effect of these policies on the integration outcomes. So, for example, the citizenship acquisition rate, also in non-European country, and to see if we are able, as for these countries, as we are for European countries, to predict integration outcomes of migrants. So this would be, for example, a way to understand if we're going in the right direction with our indexes. Then, as I showed, and also Lucy was shown before, there is really a need to go beyond the EU Western countries. I think Global Sit is amazing in that. For this coverture, we did also our part on integration policies in general. And also MIPEX and also Global Sit analysis show that European Western standards, let's say, or the ones that are conceived for, were conceived at the beginning for European Western standards, are applicable to non-Western countries. There are, of course, challenges linked to different normalized legal and political system. But from my experience with MIPEX, I must say that these differences or these challenges are applicable more to other strand of policy or integration policy in our case, and not on citizenship or access to naturalization. Like, for example, we saw, well, we had some difficulties with the permanent strand, permanent residence strand, because in some of these countries, of non-European countries, there is no concept of permanent residence. So this might be an additional challenge that we didn't face with the citizenship strand. So thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing this with you.
Great, thanks a lot. This was also right on time. Thanks for this presentation. Thanks for showing us what is new in MIPEX and also how to go beyond the current research. So what I like to do now is, as in my second role as a discussant, I don't want to discuss in detail the presentations or also the papers that I've sent to me beforehand, because first of all, some of the research that has been shown now has already been published, and I have already commented on several of these issues of these specific publications before. So there's maybe other people who have more useful comments. But what I would like to do is to give maybe look back a little bit on what has been done in the past, on what we have achieved, and especially of what has been achieved by the projects that have been presented in this panel, and then bring up some questions for next steps. So what are issues that are still open, at least to me, what could be addressed? And then maybe the presenters could briefly take up some of these questions and give their thoughts on these points that are raised. And then we can maybe open the discussion for the questions to the presentations, but also to the comments or points I bring up here. So I'm just told that I'm disabled to share my screen, so I'm not sure whether.
I'll activate it immediately, and I needed to make you go.
Okay.
It should be possible now.
Okay, great. Yeah, it works. Okay, so a brief look back to the time when I actually started to work in this field. Pretty much around 10 years ago, I started to take a look at all the indices we already had back then, and I realized that there are actually quite a lot, and I was a little bit afraid that there might be some kind of construction boom, and maybe too many indices, and I was wondering why we need that many, and whether this might lead to some index bubble and or the kind of prime mortgage crisis that was quite important issue 10 years ago. And this led to some first thoughts, first publications in this field. UI working paper with Rainer, and a special issue in comparative European politics with Martin, where we discussed several issues. We also discussed today on index building, what is useful, what is not so useful, and how to select the most appropriate indices for specific research questions. And several research gaps that we identified and that we also discussed today already several times, is that several of these indices measure similar things, are highly correlated. It also was a little bit limited regarding the explanatory factors that were analyzed. Many of the projects actually looked at very similar factors, and all the limitations that were much worse than today, and that already shows how much progress we made. The limitations regarding time and country coverage, but also regarding the more methodological issues, and along the lines also of this three aspects: conceptualization, measurement, and aggregation, that also Martin brought up this morning. It was actually astonishing often how badly the fields are defined, that we have not that much understanding what exactly a specific field is, and also how it can be distinguished from neighboring fields like integration or immigration policies, why certain items have been selected. Validity tests were almost unknown back then, and also regarding aggregation, there wasn't a lot of discussion. This is not necessary to blame these projects. Of course, we had to start somewhere, and often it's also a matter of resources actually, on how that have an influence on how much we can invest in these projects, in transparency, etc. So there's several research gaps we identified back then, and a lot of progress has been made. A lot of publications, a lot of projects. I'd just like to mention this one to make some publicity for this special issue Giacomo and I are editing, and I think it's just a coincidence, at least it wasn't planned by me, that all authors of these panels contributed to this special section in Global Policy that is about to come out any day actually, and at least it was promised to us that it comes out in April. So in case you're interested in the work the presenters today, what they presented, take a look at this special section in Global Policy. And several goals have been achieved. In the meantime, I don't need to summarize all of them. I just like to highlight some of them. First of all, actually, I like to give this quote here by Herrera and Capu in 2007 that did a paper on measurement and not necessarily index building. It wasn't about citizenship, but more generally about methodological issues in this field. And this is a quote from conclusion of one of my papers, where they say, well, there's very little on improving existing data because, and they gave two reasons. First of all, you don't get a lot of credits in publications if you work in this particular field or work on these issues. And this is especially problematic for young academics because, first of all, you don't get any credits for that, and it might also get difficult to actually improve data by actually criticizing more established scholars. And this might be problematic then on the job market. But I think this panel and the whole research field shows that this is not necessarily true, because we have, as we've just seen, a lot of young research scholars who work in this field and try to improve the existing data sets and bring up a lot of innovative ideas on how to go beyond the existing field. More world regions are covered, time periods are covered. We have a much better understanding of the validity of good indices. And as we have also seen, people do not necessarily build new indices, but actually also try to build on existing indices, try to bring together existing indices to improve the existing data quality of different projects. So I think we can say that we have achieved quite a lot over the last 10 years. Now, I would say, I think that there's still a lot of open questions, obviously, and I'd just like to bring up some ideas, some questions that might be relevant for the next years and for the next steps to take. Along the three questions, whether we might be actually in a way too abstract, whether in a way we're also too simple, and whether it's sometimes too little and too big, that data and the amount of data we have. So what does that mean? Too abstract. So by definition, index building is about aggregating indicators. And this is certainly something, well, that has a lot of advantages, but I think also a lot of disadvantages, in the sense that we might end up with indices that we do not really compare, because they include so many information that might also to some extent contradict each other, might have different tendencies. Some indicators might become more liberal or more restrictive. If we aggregate them, they balance each other out, and we find an index that doesn't move. That is also relevant when it comes to effects of policies. So, for example, we know that when we look at the research of the effect of integration indices on the integration of migrants, we often hardly find any effects, or only very small effects. So does that mean that integration policies don't work, that they don't make any difference? I'm not so sure, because all these indices are highly aggregated, and maybe some aspects of some sub-indices or some specific indicators do have an effect, but we don't see them if we aggregate too many indicators. So I think at least what we should do, and what is not done enough, I would say, is also to look at sub-indices, to disaggregate some of the indices, to look at different dimensions of the indices. So, for example, we did that in the INPIC data set, not enough, I would say, but at least we saw sometimes in some of analysis that some indices point to develop in a different way than other sub-indices of the same index. Which is quite interesting and shows us how complex it is, but it's something that we miss if we just use the highly aggregated indices. And I'm not just saying that we should disaggregate, but maybe sometimes it's also useful to really look also at very individual single indicators, especially when it comes to policy advice, because it's difficult to say that, a highly aggregated MIPEX has this or that effect. I don't know. I don't think that tells politicians anything that they would understand. What they're interested in is whether one specific policy, like a new language test, for example, has any effect at all. And that's something we do not analyze, or we cannot show with the indices we use, but actually something we have also in our data set. So that's something that's also easy to look at. And also to know actually, if we want to use highly aggregated indices, which of these indicators matter the most? And this is also related to the question of weighting, which is quite difficult to discuss. And at least my advice was always to just, weight them in the same way, because we do not really know which indicators are more important than others. But of course, in a way, I think it would be interesting to know which specific aspects of an index actually drive the results and are more relevant than maybe others. So yeah, that's just to say that we should not only aggregate, but maybe also sometimes disaggregate and look at different dimensions and even at individual indicators. Too simple, what do I mean by that? We mostly look, almost uniquely, look at the direct effects of specific indices on, be it migrant integration, migration flows, whatever our dependent variable might be, or our independent variable. But I think combinations of policies might also be interesting to look at. So not just aggregate in an additive way all the indicators we have, but look at whether a specific policy like language tests has a specific effect in the context conditional on other policy regulations, that the combination of certain policies have a multiplicative effect and not just an additive effect. So sets of policies might become relevant, and not only within one field, so within the field of naturalization policies, where we look at different combinations of policies, but also across fields that are obviously highly interrelated. And there's already some research, Martin Wu's work on policy trade-offs. Samuel is also working a lot on these questions and how different policy fields condition each other or somehow related to each other. So do they behave in the same way? Are they similarly restrictive or liberal in different countries? Do they develop in different directions? Do they influence each other? For example, in a paper I recently published together with Samuel and also Stefan Simon, we looked at the effect of immigration policies on migrant integration. So the question there was, is maybe immigration policy the better integration policy? So the short answer is that maybe not, because we didn't find that many effects, only small effects, but at least I think it was worth the exercise, at least, to ask this question whether the regulation in different fields might actually have an effect on this specific field. So how do these different policies interact with each other? Now, too little, too big. What I mean by that is what I think where we really made a lot of progress is to collect data across a larger number of countries to go global. So that's something we clearly have seen today. What is maybe still an important limitation is the across-time data collection. I mean, there's a lot of improvement there as well, but I think there's much more should or can be done. And maybe one of the most important limitations there is the funding. I think that's an experience we all made so far, is that often we only get, if we get funding at all, we get it for like a short period of time. So we can collect data for some countries for some time periods, but then we run out of money and we cannot continue, and it's very difficult, and there has been an issue for a long time, I would say, to find like permanent funding, for example, for like a permanent data collection to continue all the indices, all the data collections we have started in the past. At the same time, sometimes I'm wondering whether we also might actually collect too much data when it comes to the specific indices and the amount of indicators we include in these indices. This partly is related to the first point about the aggregation. So that's also an issue I brought up or thought about already 10 years ago. If we compare indices that include only like 6 indicators to indices that include several dozens, it's not always clear whether there's any advantages of that, or also given the fact that they are highly correlated sometimes. So we do collect a lot of data, we aggregate all this data and basically then use one single index. And it's not always clear to me whether we actually need all these indicators, especially if we don't actually analyze them individually then. So maybe we could, I'm not saying we should do that, I think that's an empirical question, but maybe we might gain some resources by actually being more parsimonious. I think the idea of the MIPEX core index is going in that direction, at least trying to, to allow the possibility to compare these different indices to see whether we find the same results when we analyze these different indices or not. So some maybe even broader questions, especially given the fact that we have now we're covering so many more continents and countries. I think an important question here is that we should keep in mind the question what we actually learn from these comparisons. Obviously, we learn a lot by getting to know new countries and specific regulations in all these countries. But how does that help us understand citizenship policies or any other kind of policy more generally? So, and this might be one of the points I brought up when Emilia was doing his presentation. So do we find the same effects in countries outside of all these Western European or Western countries that we have analyzed so far? Do we observe the same mechanisms, the same explanatory factors, the same effects? Might there even be factors we haven't thought about because we have been focused so much on developed countries, that in developing countries, these policies can be explained very differently or have also very different effects. I think that these are important questions to keep in mind to also learn something more generally for all these fields, and that should then also, for example, allow us to put in perspective policies in the West. Are they generally more restrictive or less restrictive compared to these countries, and are the mechanisms different or the same? And also then finally, I think all these new data collection efforts allow us to study more global dynamics, not just to get to know all these different countries, but to see what kind of interactions, diffusion effects we observe globally. Do policy changes on one continent, in one country, where migrants are moving away to other countries, do these policy changes then affect policy making procedures in the West, for example, or vice versa? I think these are some interesting, at least to me, some interesting questions we should or can tackle in the future. Okay, so some questions, some thoughts for future research. So maybe I briefly give each presenter, I don't know, we don't have a lot of time left, but maybe 2 or 3 minutes to pick up one or several of these points and give us their thoughts on what we should or can do next in this field of citizenship policies. Yeah, we can go in order of the presentations. Maybe Luis, you can start.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for this great input. These are critical questions I think that we need to pose ourselves, and many of them really ring a bell with my own efforts, whether things are too abstract. We have for the EMICS, it wasn't such a complex or enormous, gigantic index, but still we found out that definitely when we were speaking to policymakers, they were most interested in some of the dimensions that we had aggregated, such as return policies, investment policies, remittances, and so on. And what we did was precisely to construct a sub-index for that and write a paper, and then on the basis of that meet with people, and that was a lot more interesting. And the bigger question, this is a question that Martin asked us sometime when we were finalizing that index, was, well, what exactly does your whole aggregation say? Is it about inclusiveness of immigrants, and what is it finally? Because the point of an index is that it has to have a clear dimension of what it is aggregating for, and since our contribution there was very basic, and research on immigrant policies and diaspora engagement policies is moving, I would say, at a much slower pace than research for immigrants, our contribution was very basic, just to say these policies exist, and there is this sort of density of policies across countries that we wouldn't necessarily think are so geared towards their diaspora, such as the very famous cases of Mexico, for example. And we were able to show some very interesting things that make up the package of migration policies that states nowadays seem to be very active on. But about which policies matter, this is a question that I rather pose to my current research project, the IMISM, which that is really, it's enormous, and we feel like sometimes we are drowning in the data, and I think we have to be very selective about which indicators are more relevant, and think hard about how we will either aggregate on the combinatory logic, the set logic. I like it a lot, and the whole project that we're conducting right now tries to compare policies for immigrants and emigrants. So that might make sense for some issues, like trying to look for, you know, symmetry or coherence of certain dimensions as they apply for immigrants and immigrants. So these are really great suggestions.
Okay, thanks, Sam.
Yeah, thanks a lot for raising these points and for giving us that overview. I want to address specifically the question of aggregation. So I really think this really depends on the purpose we have in mind, right? This really depends on the research question. As you said rightly, I think that especially if we investigate effects, policymakers are interested in one pill and one pill only, a narrow policy change and the effect it has on a society that is otherwise the same, right? So, and we do have encountered this limit in our common research as well, where we use the rather aggregate impact indicator to investigate integration outcomes, and we don't know yet whether that also varies across sub-indices. So if we look at explanations of policies, then the question may be different. There we encounter usually more highly aggregated indices, and there I would just say that if we go for high aggregation, as I do in my own research, for example, then statistics really comes in, and we need to confirm the empirical existence of theoretically assumed dimensions. If we cannot do that, we should go lower and see whether we can validate there. My Citrix index is built for a specific purpose. I want to have a very broad measure of inclusiveness for ordinary immigrants, and that's the dimension I look at. And the dimensionality testing that I also do in the forthcoming paper in the global policy special section also shows that, for example, integration conditions sometimes behave differently in terms of trends, but also in terms of dimensionality. So, and we know that it's very fruitful to focus, for example, on civic integration only, as Sarah Goodman's work has shown, and how it relates to other citizenship policies. And there also this more configurational view comes in, where I of course also then validate in my dissertation a two-dimensional space of immigration openness and citizenship inclusiveness, which again, we need statistics to validate these different constructs, and we need different constructs for different purposes. And to finish, I just want to say the global SIG is really, I think, going into a very good direction of providing a very broad toolbox with very many options for many dimensions and indicators. Of course, we can expand to integration, immigration policies, emigration, everything. But I think what we should aim for is, and what would be nice in terms of funding and joining forces and resources, would really to have to agree on a set of indicators that always get up, so that we have a broad toolbox that researchers then can adapt to specific research questions. Now,
thanks, Giacomo.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. Well, I would like to address all of them, but of course I don't have time, so I will just address probably 3 of them. One, on the weighting system, of course, it's always challenging. In maps, we don't weight indicators, or well, sometimes we do by aggregating and then so the mean and then the mean of the mean, but in general, we don't do that. And when we were designing this new edition, we were thinking about introducing some weighting system. We had even maybe the crazy idea of weighting the indicators based on the need of each country. So for example, unemployment, to weight the employment strand higher when there is an higher employment gap in a country. But then we decided not to go for that, for the comparability of the results somehow. So it's something that it can be done easily for since also our data are publicly available. And this comes to also the second question, which policy matters, and the aggregation. On the aggregation, I think the indexes need to aggregate for the broad public or in general for research, etc. But of course, if the data are available, then a research or a policymaker, well, maybe a policymaker is a little bit more difficult for them, but in general, they can dig into the indicators or into the different policy areas and find what they really need. On what matters, actually, I want to provoke a little bit the debate on this, because so in the meta-analysis that we conducted, we found that actually results are more likely to be statistically significant when the MyPEX overall score is included. So comparing the MyPEX overall score and the score for each strand, let's say, so it's more likely to be significant in the effect of MyPEX on an outcome when they include the MyPEX overall score. So in terms of, for a policymaker, that or probably means that actually policymakers should have a more comprehensive approach toward immigration. So I see your point, but at the same time, it might be that also the entire package, let's say, matters. And last, but I would say not least, what we can do with this new data with the non-Western countries. What we have done with MyPEX preliminary, and we are now writing a paper on that, is to try to understand the different approaches toward the integration of migrants in different countries. So we first conduct a principal component analysis to understand the different pillars, let's say, or dimension of integration behind, let's say, our indicators. We found three main pillars that we call access to basic rights, access to opportunities, like for education or something, and access also to long-term settlement, like including, for example, citizenship. And we saw that there are different approaches to integration based on these three different pillars. And for example, we saw that in, for example, in non-Western European country, like especially in Asia, there is more an approach that applies or concern mainly long-term settlement. So it's relatively easy, or easier, let's say, to stay in the country, but there is no investment in access to rights or access to opportunity, because there is this idea that migrants should come with high skills, let's call it that, and probably they don't need, for example, strong integration policies, but they just want to work and stay in the country. Yeah, so that's all. Yeah, thank you.
Good, thanks a lot. Yeah, we already have two questions. First, Emilia, and then Martin.
Thank you. So thanks to the three of you for this super interesting presentation. So knowing that we don't have much time, perhaps I will stick to one single question that perhaps the three of you may want to respond. So it relates also to the review that Giacomo and Thomas Huddleston made on policy indices related to citizenship and migration. So I was wondering if you discovered in your research any particular research using other methods than quantitative methods, drawing on the data that is provided by policy indices. For example, I don't know, research that would use qualitative comparative analysis building on the data provided by the policy indices that you review in your paper. And it relates to a more general question that I have for our speakers. Knowing that we touched several times over the day on the issue of comparability and the need also to distinguish the hypotheses that we make in different countries, do you think that a methodology as the one that is provided by qualitative comparative analysis that relies on the asymmetry of causal relations and also on equifinality, do you think that it's a useful, that it can be helpful in a global perspective, knowing that it can allow you to differentiate your hypothesis in different groups of countries?
Okay, then maybe directly Martin.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark, and all the speakers. So let me also ask the one question on my mind is the question of the scope conditions that relates to the going global, right? And I wanted to push you on this, all three, but maybe especially Sam and Giacomo on the naturalization policies. And that's the question of the bounded validity, right? So how far can a valid measure actually extend geographically of naturalization policies? So I mentioned this a bit in the morning, but I'm not sure about your take on this. So does it make sense to develop a C-TRIX or a MyPax access to nationality for all 200 countries in the world, given the way that you measure this, right? Which is based on formal aspects of nationality law, jus soli provisions, and residence-based naturalization provisions, right? Given the differences in your operationalization, but they are, I don't think, so fundamental. And I'm not convinced that, it does make sense, right? So there are at least 2 points. First of all, birth registration, right? So there are simply a lot of countries in the world where, of course, births are not registered, and maybe that doesn't mean that you can never acquire the citizenship of a country. But Bronwyn, for example, has written also recently a couple of pieces about this and a blog. And of course, how meaningful is a jus soli if births are not registered, right? And what we see in the also the MyPax 2020 is that, of course, the American countries are topping the chart, and that's because jus soli weighs heavily in this, right? So even if you're not weighing, it does weigh into that, right? And we see the same, of course, with I saw the same when I applied the C-TRIX rules to the global CIT data, right? That is dominated by the American countries, and that may be fair in the sense that if births are registered, it provides jus soli access, birthright citizenship to the descendants of the immigrants. But that doesn't say anything about the naturalization policies, right? So they are registered, they are measured separately. And then for the naturalization policies, we have other problems, namely rule of law, right? So I'm a bit on 2 feet here because I'm extremely interested in comparing across regimes, right? So also looking at political regime effects, but how meaningful is it to measure formal law aspects across systems where there is no rule of law, right? And maybe to push you on this, Giacomo, on one point where is China, right? So it's nice that this is now added to MyPax 2020, but you are considering access to nationality halfway favorable in China. Now, I'm not an expert on China, but Luc van der Baren and I, we also struggled a bit with this. And for example, access to nationality gets a higher score for China than, for example, Spain, Italy, and Greece, right? And I think that's, right, so you're saying in your, on the website, the path to Chinese citizenship is shorter and clearer than the average MyPax country. And I think that's extremely problematic and not valid, right? If I can put it like this. So I know that if I'm correct, there is a 5-year residence requirement for some kind of citizenship access in China. But what Luc and I, after some searching, and there is not so much, it's difficult to get very good information about this. But what we eventually concluded is that there is no residence-based naturalization, no ordinary naturalization in China, but there is a provision, very discretionary, for access to citizenship on for special merit in mainland China, and then in Macau and Hong Kong, the situation is different, right? So it seems that there it functions a bit more as a naturalization provision, whereas in mainland China, this is more complicated. So my comment is not about the Chinese case in particular, right? But it's about the scope condition. So how meaningful is a policy index, especially based on formal legal aspects that tries to capture overall inclusiveness, at least on access to nationality. And it seems to me that, and so I'm a bit torn because I also agree with Luigi that, of course, we should avoid, let's say, Western typical immigration bias, but at the same time, there is a trade-off with the validity of the measure, right? And I think there's actually, right, what I concluded was that there was maybe a group of 70 or so countries where we have, high birth registration rates over 90 that also are democracies. So there's some kind of rule of law where it might make sense to measure this, right? But I think there is a certain limit, and this may be less of a problem if we follow Mark's suggestion also, I suggested something in the morning where we might look at individual, completely disaggregated indicators, right? When we don't throw everything together, maybe it makes more sense to compare that across all 200 countries in the world. And I think, you know, we can say something about nationality laws when we compare across countries, but yeah, access to nationality for immigrants and their children in practice, I think there are certain limits, right? So yeah, it's a big question, but since we have a going global talk, I still wanted to push, especially maybe Sam and Giacomo on this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So who wants to answer first?
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Go Sam. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. First to Emilia's question about QCA. I mean, it really depends on quite a number of things. So for some, this is really an ontological, epistemological question of whether to use this method at all. If you use it, you must know that many classical quantitative and also some classical qualitative scholars don't like it, and it's a very particular community that does this. It also, you have to buy into certain ontological assumptions about set theory, about how to measure things. And it's really, to me, it is more of a question of whether you want to really explain an outcome and various ways to this outcome, and then how you define the outcome. Is it a categorical outcome? Is it ordinal? Can you translate it into a set? And then are you interested of specific pathways and configurations of conditions that lead to that outcome or are sufficient for an outcome? So this is a very specific mode of research and research question. And if you go for a more regression type of analysis, it's more eccentric. So you're more focusing on specific factors, and it's the more classical approach. And there are also approaches like Boolean logit that I've already mentioned that try to kind of do a similar thing with that QCA does with statistics. So there are many options on the table, but there are ontological questions, the scaling of your variables, and ultimately really what your research question is, what method you should set for. So that would be my opinion on this. On the bounded validity challenge, let's say, from Martin, I really agree. So what I've done with this proposal of a hybrid approach is really not to offer any kind of definite solution, but it was more an act of brainstorming, really, and to really try it out. You've seen I have like the basic ideas, but we would have to explore, for example, how do we compare dual citizenship policies with this kind of flexible indicator approach that I outlined, and I haven't had the time to really make an example indicator of what we would do this, and it's certainly very hard, but I think we should try to at least explore the possibility by perhaps specifying a model indicator and then testing it, and then really show iteratively, do we come to a valid measure or do we really limit the scope? For example, we could really say, yeah, only naturalization, because the birthright registration is something, maybe we can compare naturalization, but I do agree that the rule of law scope condition is also very relevant. So I don't really have a good answer. And as I said, maybe my approach is useful to identify what we could see as functional equivalents also in an informal or in a non-democratic context, but maybe it's not useful at all and we should ditch the idea. So, but I would hope that we would test it a bit further and see how far we might get into going truly global, or then having a more differentiated approach that you propose, which I also find on the face of it very appealing and rigorous as well. Yeah.
Okay, and from my side on the QCA, I must say that I think we found just one or two articles employing them. Well, I think some really summarized the state of the art on that, and I agree with him actually. On going global, yeah, sure, there are some challenges, some difficulties. The case of China and other countries is one of them, and also one person in the comment was stating that it's the same in the Arab world. This country on paper, they have, let's say, less restrictive policies then probably in practice it's really difficult to get it. That's why, but we are not sure. I mean, I'm not an expert of China. I talk with a Chinese expert, but that's why I was saying that I would like to see analysis on these countries showing the effect of policies on outcomes, to see if the validity that we found, for example, in MIPEX for Western country is also replicate for a non-Western country. So yeah, so I understand the point. I also see that sometimes maybe the result needs to be contextualized and addressed more in detail. So like, for example, it's not just the sentence that you mentioned, but it was more in general the profile of China. But yes, it's one of the challenges, of course. Yeah.
But sorry, but I would just warn against adding also the United Arab Emirates and the other countries. Yeah, what does it mean if you're adding China in there as halfway favorable? I'm not right, because for example, it would be nice to test this, but we don't have naturalization statistics to test the validity of access to nationality in China, right? So that's how would we cannot empirically test it. So the only way is to use country information and then maybe some theoretically plausible scope conditions.
No, well, that's true. No, I mean, I have no solution on that. But in theory, what I would like to see is that one, yeah. But that's why, for example, we speak about that it's easier for some categories of migrants to get naturalized or to get permanent residence, like high-skilled, because, for example, most of the time, one of the only requirement actually is to have enough economic resources. But yeah. But your point is definitely true about the lack of statistics.
Just quickly on a point, the same issue comes up when we explain citizenship policies across political regimes. If you have far-right parties in democratic, how do you cover far-right party politics in autocratic regimes? I mean, this doesn't make sense. So it's also a question of independent variables we employ, what contexts we can cover and what not, or what to assign. If I assign a score of 0 for far-right party strength for a dictatorship, it doesn't mean the same thing as 0 for the far-right votes in a democracy. So this also goes into your direction again, Emilia, with your project.
No, I think this comparison between democratic and non-democratic countries is probably the most challenging one for these fields and many other fields as well. Yeah. Are any last comments? Maybe Lucy, I don't know whether you have any last reactions or comments, or anybody else?
No, it's okay. I tried myself using QCA in the past, Emilian, and I can also say that it's very, very challenging. And some of the problems that Mark mentioned before between trying to be very selective about the policies that matter would really become magnified if you use QCA, because it's really very, very demanding when you need to code the conditions. So you have to be extremely picky about what you choose, and that's only one of the many things that neither Sam nor Giacomo mentioned, but that probably explain why researchers tend to stay away from it. It's important for some issues. I mean, it helped me with case selection, for example. I think it led to a plausible strategy for case selection.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for a great panel. Thanks for the presentations and the questions and comments and discussions. We have our coffee break and we continue, if I see it correctly, at 5 o'clock. So thanks a lot.